In this video, we're going to be using SAP Business Objects Data Services to connect to a COBOL copybook and import that data into SAP HANA. So the first thing we need to do is to log into Data Services. So we do that by going to Start. We can access that from All Programs, Data Services, and we choose the Data Services Designer. Log in with your credentials. So for me it's student and the password is welcome1, and then it logs you into the system. So the first thing we need to do is look at the data that we're going to import. So within my library I have two data files. One is called a STS orders file and one is an STS orders structure CPY file. So if I look at the text file, this is what a COBOL copybook looks like. So essentially all the data is squashed onto a unique line with header and footer rows. The CPY file determines the structure of the file. So if I open this file with Notepad, this is a simple example of a CPY file, which details that the first few columns are the order record, and then we have the order line is indicated with the second paragraph. So how do we import that data? Well, within SAP Business Objects Data Services, we do this in our 7th tab, which is our file formats. And then we right click on our COBOL Copybooks formats folder and select New. So the first thing to do is select that CPY file, which essentially is the structure of the COBOL copybook. We can do this by clicking on Browse, going to My Library and selecting the CPY file. Now here we can select Generate the Record Number field, which will essentially give us a primary key for each of the records within that file. The next step within the Data File tab is to simply select the data. So for us, again, if I click on File Name and go to Select File, within my library I have a file called STS Orders, which is that large file with the ones and the zeros and the data squashed together. There's only a few things that I have to change on this screen. The first thing is that the actual code page of the data is plain ASCII. So we can actually change the code page here to CP1252. Lastly is that our file actually has two extra characters in it. So those two characters are the carriage return line feed characters, which this breaks up the line into the file into multiple lines. So to deal with that, we have to select the record trail length equals to 2. The last thing to do is to give the file a name. So I'm going to call this one STS Orders. The last tab, which is the Data Access tab, allows us to connect to this CPY and copybook files via FTP or via another method, such as cron. So the last thing I need to do is select the Format tab and click on OK. So Data Services will then read the CPY file and determine the structure of the data. So of course, if we wanted to, we could rename the column. So I can double click and rename any of the columns, but I'm going to leave it as order record and order line and click on OK. So the next step is just to see if we can see the data. So to do that, I'm going to right click and select View Data. Then, because this CPY file has two data sets in it, we have to choose which one we want to see. So we need to specify the row type. So to do this, we go back to our COBOL copybook, we right click on it and we edit it. So there's a tab, another tab's appeared called Field ID. And what we need to do with this field ID is select the schema field in the list of data sets to view its specific clauses and to choose the right column. So if I go to the order record line and choose record type, we are then given the option to use the field as our ID. If I then select that, I can enter a value below. So again, in our line, we have the record L, which will determine an individual line. Just to show you that, if I go into my library again and look at that file, of course we have two different lines. We have H for a header line, and this is the actual line of data. So this line of data actually belongs to this header. And these three lines of data belong to this header, so we need to determine which is the line. And again, we do that by selecting the L in our field ID. So now that we've done that, we can click on OK. We can go back to STS orders and we can view the data. So firstly, let's look at the order record. Again, we have two records as we saw before. And also within the order record, I can go and view the orders. So if I right click and say, right click on the copybook, select view date and choose order line, we can also see each of the lines. So obviously that's the first thing you need to do before you start to load the data into SAP HANA. So now that we've previewed the data and we know that data services can read the data, now is the time to load it into SAP HANA. So to do this, I'm going to create a new project called COBOL CPY, and then a new job underneath the project called COBOL CPY, and lastly we need our data flow. Of course, the reasons you would use jobs and multiple data flows will be discussed in another video. Again, because we have that primary key defined on the actual source, if I was to drag the COBOL copybook as a data source, we need to choose firstly which table we want to have outputted. So I'm going to output this as an order record. If I click on the magnifying glass, you can see that the record number 01 indicates the primary key. So we already have that key here. However, we need to use the query transform to define which column is the primary key. And there's a few other reasons why we'll need to use a query transform, as you'll see. One thing I'm going to show you is that we can, if we want, drag on STS orders, select order line on the same canvas. You can have multiple transformations on the same screen, but there's actually a better way for us to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these two and I'm going to build the job, but the job is going to contain two data flows. This will introduce you to the idea of data flows. So this one is the COBOL copybook, but I'm going to rename this to be order record. Notice you cannot have any characters like dashes, backslashes, ampersands. So when you rename, you can have an underscore. So this data flow is going to load the order record. But I'm going to create another data flow which will contain the order line. So this is the COBOL CPY underscore order line. So we can actually run these in parallel, or we can run these in series. To make them run in series, we actually don't need to, but just to show you how we make these run in parallel, of course we just leave them next to each other or underneath each other, it doesn't matter. To make them run in series, you would join the first one to the second one. This means, of course, that this data flow will not start until this one has finished. So now I'm just going to save that. And I'm going to go into my job. So let's firstly deal with the record line. So again, I'm going to select STS orders, drag it on the screen and select this is the order record. Like before, we need that query transform, which we're going to join the source to the query transform. And we need a template table. So this is going to be called in the STS schema COBOL order rec for order record. And then I will click on OK after I've corrected that to SDS. Again, in a table name you can't have any dashes or ampersands, but you can have underscores. So now I'm going to join the query to the target. So there's a few things we need to do here. Well, we can select all the columns from the source and drag them to the right. But there's a few interesting things here about the data. Well, firstly, what I can do is I can change this ID, instead of having it called record number 01, to change the name of the column, I can double click and I can call this load underscore ID. Or I'm going to call this actually order ID. And we're going to make this a primary key. So that's the first way. The second thing that we can do is we can deal with the date. So we have an order date here. Now, of course, this comes to us as a varchar, but it's very easy to convert this to a date, and there's many places you can do it. To do it here, all I need to do is say to underscore date, and then in single quotes, I just need to define what it is. So if I go back to the data flow and look at the data within that STS orders, I can see that it starts with the year, then it contains the month, and then it contains the day. So if I go back to my query and change this to 4 Ys, 2 Ms, and a DD, then that is the format that it will read, and it would load that to a date. So now that we're loading that to a date, of course, I can change this data type from a varchar 8 to a date. To do this, you can double click on the column and select it from the list of drop downs. So I'm going to change this to date. So that's a very simple example of how we can transform the data and add and rename a column, and also obviously add a primary key. So that's the first stage, and again I'll just validate just to make sure that there's no errors. There we go. Now let's go back. If I save this, I can close all my windows, because sometimes it can get a bit confusing if you have a lot of windows open, and we can go back to the order lined data flow. It's the same thing. I'm going to select STS orders, make this the order line, add a query transform, and add a template table. I'm going to call this one COBOL underscore order line, and this is going to go in the STS schema in HANA. And of course I'll join that query to the target. Now this also has order, record order, and again I've already created this column elsewhere, but again we had to define that key, and so you can see we've got that record type key here. So you can actually use, this isn't actually going to be the key, but you could actually use that to build a composite key, for example, if you wanted to. But again, I'm going to select the record number, change the column to order ID, or order ID, make it a primary key, and then I'm going to select all the other columns. Now we don't need this record type, but we do need all the other columns. I'm going to drag them across, and again I'm going to deal with the dates by double clicking, but I'll do this in a slightly different way. We can go to our list of functions, select our conversion functions, and then we've got our function name called toDate, which again converts a string to a date under the control of a format string, which is the second part of the function. Again, here I can choose from order line that I want to apply this to delivery date, and again here in single quotes I put the format, which is YYYMMDD, and then click on finish. So it's just another way of actually applying the transform to the function. So the last thing to do is to deal with this date. So at the moment we're outputting it as a varchar 8. We've applied a toDate, so we just need to convert this and change the format to a date. and then click on OK. So we've converted the date here, we've applied the two dates, and again if I go back to my other query, we've converted the order dates here, and again, oops, one mistake there, I need to add the YYYY MMDD. Of course, what I can do is I can either validate at this level, just to make sure that there are no errors, but one thing that you can do as well is go to the top level of a job and click on this next icon here, which is validate all. This is a great feature because it will drill down to the lowest level and validate all the objects in the job. Now you might also get these errors, or they're not really errors, they're warnings from time to time, but as long as it's a warning, it's fine. It's when you get an error that the job probably won't run. So now that we've actually corrected that, we can actually execute the job. So I'm going to right click, select execute, and click on OK. It prompts me to save the data flows, which is fine, and then I'll click on OK. Now what you should see is that the order record data flow executes first, and when it's finished, the order line record, the order line data flow executes. So if I scroll up, we should have seen that happen here. So the job starts, and as you can see here, it's saying the order record completed successfully at 35 seconds and 18 minutes past 12. But then straight afterwards, the second data flow started, which was this order line. So order record finished and order line started. So you can see it's very easy to deal with order within data services. So obviously the first thing I'm checking is that there's no errors. Well, the job's completed successfully. I can see that there are no errors. I can then click on the monitor tab and we can see that 2 rows were taken in terms of order records and 11 rows were taken in terms of order lines. Again, I can close all my windows and we can go and view that data. So of course, one way to check the data is to go back into the HANA Studio and expand the system, go into the STS schema and just validate that the data is there. So if I expand the system, expand the catalog, go into the STS schema and expand the tables folder, we can see that we've got the table which is COBOL order rec. So if I open and do a data preview, we can see that we've got the 2 rows. We can see that we've got a date. Great. Then the next step is to right click and select order line and again do a data preview. And we can see that the data has indeed been loaded and we've got a valid date. Of course, we can also validate that the data is there by going to HANA, clicking on each data flow and selecting the magnifying glass next to the relevant target table within HANA. So that's a very, very simple way in which we can use SAP Business Objects Data Services to connect to a COBOL copybook, extract the structure, transform the data in some way, and then load that data into SAP HANA.